Good evening. I'm Mira Schlossberg. Before we start tonight's Toolkits Live, I want to acknowledge that we are broadcasting on stolen lands. We're broadcasting from the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. And we pay respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations people who are tuning in tonight. And we extend this respect to the elders of the lands on which this broadcast reaches. It was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. Express Media is a vital organization essential to the literary arts and broader communities. It's acknowledged and valued as the peak organization for young Australian writers aged 12 to 30. For the past 30 years, Express Media has been developing, supporting, and promoting young writers through workshops that develop skills, through opportunities for constructive feedback and publication, and through awards and programs that recognize excellence. Toolkits is a 12-week program for writers under 30 to develop their skills in a unique and exciting online environment. Each program includes one-on-one mentoring and feedback from an established writer, specialized presentations from guest artists, and the opportunity to network with other young people working in the same literary form. And Toolkits is made possible through the generous support of the Copyright Agency Cultural Fund. These Toolkits Live sessions are presented by Express Media in partnership with Regional Arts Victoria as part of the Arts Connect series funded by the federal government's Regional Arts Fund. So welcome to our first Toolkits Live session for Toolkits Graphic Narratives. For the first time in 2019, Express Media is presenting Toolkits Graphic Narratives, an online course in the forms, skills, and ethics of creating graphic narratives. This program combines theoretical approaches, practical exercises, and one-on-one mentorship to guide young writers through the development of their work. I'm Mira Schlossberg. I'm a writer and comics artist and the editor of VoiceWorks magazine, and I'm the facilitator for Toolkits Graphic Narratives. And this is Rachel Ang. Rachel Ang is a comics artist from Melbourne, Australia. Her work has been published by The Lifted Brow, Cordite Poetry Review, Going Down Swinging, Scum, and the Stella Prize. She's the co-editor of Comic Sans, a new anthology of excellent Australian comics. Her first graphic novel, Swimsuit, was published last year by local boutique Mizo Press. We have it here, Glom Press. And she has a master's degree in architecture from RMIT. So Rachel is joining us this evening to talk about tools and how to use them, from ink to paint and all sorts of theoretical tools as well. Choosing which materials when you're starting a comic can be daunting. So this evening, Rachel's going to break down the what and how of all the drawing and editing tools and how to find what works best for you. If you want to ask Rachel any questions during this Toolkits Live session, you can tweet them to Express Media. It's Express__media, 2 underscores, on Twitter, and the hashtag is #EMToolkits. All right, so welcome, Rachel. So, shall I just? Yeah, cool. Sorry, I'll speak up. So I'm mainly going to talk about theoretical toolkits, and I will touch on drawing because I think that comics are mainly in your mind. That sounds way too abstract, but I do think that people get very hung up on drawing and think that they're not good at drawing. That really holds them back. So I'll just try to focus on ways to think about comics because I think that would be helpful. So in every artist toolkit, there are different kinds of tools. You might group all your pencils together, or the nib pens, or the erasers, and each of them serves a different purpose in the process of making art. So we have a limited time, so I'm going to talk about tools, and I'm going to divide them up into a couple of main categories, which are firstly ways to think about comics. So that's schemas that I find useful, mental maps about the art form. 2, the form of things. So firstly, structures like grids and visual syntax and how to use that, and guides. And the second part of that is forms within those structures. So like visual vocabulary, how to draw the world, how to draw the artist in the world.
The third will be physical tools and ways to use them. So that's like pencils, pens. That's the part that I feel the least like I really know what people would be interested in, because it's very natural to me. So hopefully you all have a lot of questions by that. And then we'll be open to questions, and you can ask things of Mira or myself. So yeah, I think the most valuable tool in crafting graphic narratives is having a strong idea, or preferably plural ideas, about what comics are and what they can do, without any value judgments or genre kind of attached to that. So I feel like I've gotten into a few arguments with people about what a comic is or isn't, and whether some forms of comics are more legitimate than others. I don't think that's the case, and I prefer to take the widest and most inclusive approach possible to thinking about graphic narratives, that it's a story told with images, that we know a comic when we see one, and that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So here are some useful definitions of comics. Firstly, and most fundamentally, comics describe time and space, or times and places. One image or panel in front of another describes time passing. These can go in any direction. So in Western comics, it tends to go right to left, top to bottom, but in manga, the eye moves from oh dear, oh no, shit. Moves from top to bottom, left to right. And the picture plane is usually broken up in a much more dynamic way. So, well, this page is a bit graphic. And this, I should tell you what these examples are as I show them. So this is Utsubura, the story of a novelist, by Asumiko Nakamura. It's a really good graphic novel. So I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and when you draw a comic, you're just drawing now, and they're just like images that are discrete. And the reader is the one who threads those images together. And that's what makes reading comics so fun and exciting, that your mind gets to live in the gaps between the images, and you must be an active reader. You're the one that threads those images together and interpret the story for yourself. And therefore, everybody has a different experience of the story. So, for example, this is Panther by Brett Evans. It's a really beautifully drawn graphic novel. So in this example, we are totally covered. You can see there's no separation between each panel, so there's an even greater and more amorphous kind of gap for the mind to fill. Sort of the distinction between what happens first or second is quite ambivalent, sort of amorphous, I think. And it's also very interesting in this story how the artist flips from smaller panels to which show like fast action to larger panels that take up the whole space, and your eye moves around the page and time kind of slows down for those parts. So check it out. Another example of this is, oh no, is that supposed to happen? Okay. This example is Generous Bosom by Connor Schulte. He's an American graphic novelist. So in this example, you can see how it's a risograph comic. Not sure you can see that, but you can see how there's two timelines laid one on top of the other in two different colors across 4 panels, right? But you can see these top panels show one scene, and this shows another scene, which is an empty bar. So the build-up of lines creates like this very the build-up of lines and textures creates this sense of foreboding and dark and shadow, and this sense of, as you move through the story, of moving forwards and backwards in time. So the next kind of useful way of thinking of comics is is being observant. That sounds like a kind of mindfulness app thing, but I can't remember where I heard this definition. I think it might be from Linda Barry, which is that noticing things and being observant is the practice and comics are the byproduct. And I know that sounds very abstract, because obviously that's the key to being a good writer in general, is to just be like a really kind of present, observant person. But there is something about the immediacy of comics that really lends itself to work that is slice of life or observational or just really quotidian. So a good example of that is this new book by Mandy Ord, which is out now, called When One Person Dies, the Whole World is Over. So you can see each day is a page. It's just a diary, and you know, it's 3 or 4 interesting things that happen to her each day, and she's quite strict about keeping to the same structure each day, which I think makes it a good net to catch all their observations. And this is another example, which I think I bought this last time I was in Wellington. It's called Incredibly Hot Sex with Hideous People, by Bryce Galloway. So again, it's something very, I'm sure you can really see the lines there, but something about it which is very taken from life, and I think the crappiness of it really appeals to, I think, truth of life. And then the last example I'll give of that is John Paul Ciolino, is a really exciting kind of minimal comics maker. So their work is very, not sure how to describe it. Very simple observation of life, and for a long time, and maybe still, they make the zine called King Cat, which they send out. So this book from Lone Mountain is a collection of those, and a lot of it is just like the things that he read, conversations about life. Okay, and then the third kind of idea about comics, which I think is useful, is that comics are a special kind of handwriting. So I think people get really hung up on the drawing aspect of comics, but comics are not illustrations in a sequence, right? I think that's a misunderstanding that people have, and they really fixate on each kind of panel and think, oh, this has got to be, you know, the money shot. This has got to be. It's kind of, and I'm not sure if that's something that's held over from superhero comics or whatever, but I think, and this relates back to the flow of now, and trying to throw them together into a story. I think each artist's drawing style is their voice, and I think a well-developed artist has good control over that line and can manipulate it to pull you through the story. I think the best way to do this is to just show some examples. So this is Raw Fields by Leonie Briley, who's from Western Australia originally. So you can see the emphasis is not on each individual panel, but rather on the line that is consistent and flows through the whole story. And if you manage to get a copy of this, I highly recommend reading it immediately. This here. I think she's not selling them anymore. I don't know.
But maybe that's just me.
Yeah. How beautiful is that? So idiosyncratic, and it's really each kind of line really holds some kind of rhythm, which is repeated again and again through the book, the DNA of the story. And then this is another example, which is Australian, Home Time by Campbell White. So what's interesting about this, amongst many things, is that it has within it a lot of different drawing styles, but it's always really unique, and it's always Campbell. And so this way of manipulating drawing style, and how sort of masterfully he does that, really breaks up the story in an interesting way, and sort of emphasizes the idea that you're moving through different worlds. And another example, this is really beautifully drawn book, is Skim by Ciolino Mariko Tamaki. So the quality of the line, which sometimes is really repeated over and over again to create more detailed scenes, is really gives a sense of spaciousness, I think. I almost feel like each line is really, I don't know how to describe it with words, so I'll just show you more. But yeah, that's the cover. And then the last kind of idea or schema of comics, which I think is useful to think about, is the difference between figure and ground, and to think about the gutters and gaps as the syntax of the sentence, or the syntax of the comic in general. Because as I mentioned before, the reader is the one who kind of connects things and puts them together. So, for example, and this book is Bottled by Chris Gooch. You can see how this is a single image, really, the sky broken up into panels, but it gives a sense of time passing and momentum building as like the conversation is pinging across it, and a sense of space and distance between the characters talking. And then another example, a good example of that, Black Hole by Charles Burns. So if you, and he's kind of the master of this, but if you look at each page, how it's just black and white, there's nothing in between, and it's just made up of these shapes that kind of shimmer and flow against each other. And sometimes you get the impression that he's started with a black background and drawn with white ink over the top. And so talking about the gutters again, and how your eye needs to move around the page and put together the story for yourself. This gives this sense of kind of ambiguity, or mixing timelines, in this sense that the person telling the story is an unreliable narrator, and they're not really sure what's happening, and it's just amazing. Cool. So yeah, those are some cool ways to think about comics that might be useful. The next thing I'll talk about is structure of comics, like grids and how to break it up on the page. I like to think of the grid as something like bars in a piece of music. So it's a structure or measure to use, and sets up the pacing of the story, which can be really helpful. So an example of a 6-panel grid is, let me find it. Yes. Super Mutant Magic Academy, which is really great. So it tells the story of something like Hogwarts, but a lot cooler. These characters that they do have magical powers, but mainly they just deal with puberty and being gay and stuff. It's really great. So it's always 6 panels, and the 6-panel structure allows for really loose and changeable content. I think it was originally published as a webcomic, so that probably had something to do with how consistent the structure is. But then within that, it changes so much page to page. And I think it's quite surreal. I like it when the drawings are a bit more minimal.
And this also is by the same artist that did Skim, and like you can really see, even though all the drawings are so different, that's like what you're talking about with handwriting. I think Gillian Tamaki has like a really strong,
absolutely,
like image that no matter what medium or like how detailed the drawing is, you can always tell that it's her.
Yeah, absolutely. And then so actually, I've used a 6-panel grid as well, and I'll just show this as an example. So I did this comic called Dream Diary, which is like an ongoing thing. And it's a similar thing, that it's a journal that I kept, which is dreams that I had that are edited into stories. So each page tells a dream, and it's strict to the structure because I wanted it to just be, I didn't want to have to think about it, I just wanted to catch the dreams that I had. So a 9-panel grid. Oh, I forgot to bring Mark's comic. I forgot to bring a 9-panel grid to show, but it's a really traditional and great structure for telling longer, more involved narratives. I think it's because 3 lines sets up a sense of movement and momentum, because it's like the setup, the complication, and the resolution all within one page. And then 9 allows you to have that rhythm like across the page like this as well, if that makes sense. So I wrote this story about taking a train, and it's based on 3 lines, and then within that I manipulate it. So you can see sometimes you get 9 panels, and then sometimes it's broken down a lot more depending on what is happening and the pacing of that part of the story. And then so 4 panels is something that I think is becoming more common. So this is a good example which I really like. Alex Crocus, he's big on the Instagrams. So, oh no, I'm unshill. No! So, I think it's because it fits into a square, and like the biggest way to get known for comics these days is to be big on Instagram. So that's probably why I'm noticing more 4 square grids. And I think it's good for setting up jokes or episodic stories, but maybe wouldn't work great for a longer running narrative. And then, so to go back to Mandy Ord again, you can see how the 4 panels is really good for showing each day as a discrete episode. And then another example of 4 grid is, let me find it. My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness is a good manga. So you can see how it's divided into 4 panels each page, but down the page like a really tight ribbon. So that works. I would find that difficult, but it works because she can pack a lot into each panel, and she has a very simple stylized style of drawing. And then what else? I'll just talk about another structure which is good is having no gutter, and it's very tight, so that lends itself to very kind of tense, claustrophobic story, I think. And so you can see again how that really works with the overlapping of images and colours and textures, that there's not that much separation between any of these things. So how are we going for time and stuff?
25 minutes left.
Yeah.
Okay. There's one question that's coming.
Okay, tell me what the question is.
The question is, how... Oh, there's more than one. Oh. Where did the first one go? The first one was, how do you start out drafting a large page?
Yeah, sure. I think the best way to start out drafting any page is to start really small. So like maybe this size or smaller, like a stamp, because no matter what size the panel is, it really needs a strong composition, and that's actually easier to work out at a smaller scale. And I think if you look at a lot of really amazing, successful kind of large panels, they do work as a whole. Oh, geez, this is another graphic page. There is a kind of, they're very strong compositions, and that would work at any scale. I think, so I would start out every story by drawing it really small in pencil, and then figuring out the rhythm of things, and then I would make each one larger and kind of focus on each one. And I think you should only draw in maybe 2 colors without nuance, just black and white, to kind of figure out the foreground and the background first, the figure and ground, before you get too complicated about it.
The second question is, starting a comic is so daunting. How do you actually start one? Do you sketch?
For me, what happened, I've got a sketchbook, and I will fill it up all the time with little images or things that I saw, and notes. I write a lot of notes to myself. I think one thing that a good way of prompting ideas is to remember that there is always a gap between the image and the text, and that gap can be really close, like the text can just describe the image, which is quite prosaic, or they can be really far apart, right? And if you make the gap really far apart, then lots of interesting stuff that is unexplainable can happen in the gap. So sometimes I will, with the notes that are words and the drawings that are just observations, I will kind of cut them up and then put them together, right? Pairing an image with the text. And often that is, the randomness of that is, there's something that catalyzes something for me, and that helps me start a story.
It's really useful advice. How can you get your work to stand out? You mentioned Instagram.
I think, I'm not sure if Instagram is over, as they say, because of oversaturation, but I do think it's really useful. And and I'm actually not very popular on Instagram, so
I thought you were.
No, not compared to our friends like at Dillings. And I think, and actually this answers a question that I got asked on my Instagram story earlier this afternoon, which was, how do you get started in the Australian indie comic scene? So I'll answer both of them. For me, I came to make comics through making zines, actually, and having a lot of friends who were part of that scene and that world. And then from that, I got asked to make a comic for the Lifted Brow, and I've done stuff with them since then. I think the best way to distinguish yourself is to have something that is sincere and unusual about your style, because there's a lot of people making stuff, but a lot of it is trash, or like it's really kind of stuff that could have come out of a fortune cookie, right? So like I was honestly just drawing really short comics, zines, photocopying them and giving them to people that I knew. But that's now that, given this setting, that seems really lo-fi, and maybe they want me to say something about social media or...
No, I think that's good. I think like actually just producing work and giving it to people is a really good way to get people to read your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's also a kind of, and maybe this sounds a bit like I think a meritocracy exists, which obviously it doesn't. But I think if your work is good, then it actually creates hunger for it, right? If you look at someone like Simon Hanselman, who's maybe the success story that a lot of Australian comic makers would like to have, he just made so many comics and didn't show anyone, and then one day put them on Tumblr, and now got lots of book deals. Yeah, successful. So I think it's sort of, but what I would say is that it used to be that like with anything like music or writing and stuff, people really waited to be discovered. And I would say that one great thing about the internet is that you don't need to wait to be discovered. Like you can be your own publisher, and that is a very exciting sort of thing.
Yeah, I do think the like thing to keep in mind is that like focusing on like getting popular on Instagram is not like the best thing for you. Like I think Instagram is really difficult for a lot of artists because the algorithms like make it so that nobody sees their stuff. Yeah. And then they're like, oh, like nobody likes my art. The algorithm's destroying my life. Yeah. And like if you're just like going out in the world physically giving people comics and getting an immediate response to your face, it can help to ease that.
I think that's the sense of recognition or whatever, and algorithms is one thing that is useful, but like the sense of community that I have through comics, so like the friends that I met Mira through making comics, like so many of the people that I count amongst my closest friends, it was really just giving them stuff and them giving me stuff, and the camaraderie of encouraging each other and pushing each other to be better. So I think you should always, like, rather than likes or networking and stuff like that, you should always like value real connection over stuff that is maybe more fleeting. I think as well, like most of these artists whose work I've shown as examples of exciting stuff, some of them don't have any followers on Instagram. Do you know what I mean? It's actually there's not that strong a correlation between being an amazing graphic novelist and being popular on social media, because these people, like, you have to be extremely introverted to want to make comics. It's just a grind, right? It's just hours and hours spent alone drawing the same thing over and over again. That's how you make comics, unfortunately.
The last question says, what got you into comics?
I was asked this in an interview yesterday. I had a lot of like quite formative experiences that now I look back on them weren't reading comics, but excited me to want to make them. So once when I was like 8, I was running down this staircase with my brother and sister, and at the foot at this landing, there was this massive window, right? And it was broken up with mullions and transoms, like a comic. And it was so, like the sky seemed so big and so close, and the clouds were moving really fast across it. And there were so many times like that where I've thought about how architecture frames life and how comics frame life, and how lining images up just tells really exciting stories in a way that just words can't. I think when I was growing up, I was discouraged from reading comics that much. Like, I think my parents saw them as quite lowbrow, and they really tried to encourage me to, like read real European literature. So it wasn't, I've only been making comics like 3 or 4 years. It's only like in adulthood that I really surrendered to loving lowbrow stuff.
Comics are not lowbrow. I mean, they can be. That's so romantic. I feel like I've never heard anyone talk about comics like that way.
Yeah.
At like such a young age, being able to say that kind of stuff.
I think, and like, or like walking through a colonnade and seeing the scene change, walking past the columns and how that rhythm punctuates the scene, or like sometimes if I'm walking through the forest and the way the light moves across the trees and how that's so much like the panels of a comic, like the shadows moving across the ground, like those kind of things really inspire me to make comics more than actually reading comics.
Are there any more questions?
I think. Oh my God, there's so many messages. I just want to read. No, that's okay. I just want to read the questions that I've got. All right. Someone asked me on Instagram what are our favorite all-time comics. So,
Oh my God. I think it's so difficult to pick because I've been like reading it across like a lot of different genres for a really long time. I'm tempted to say this is maybe not my all-time favorite, but like the first, or like one of the first comics I ever read was the Magic Knight Ray series. It's like a Clamp comic.
Yeah, I love Clamp.
But I was just reading a really interesting article about like the imagery in that kind of manga and how it came directly from this like one lesbian writer who was really famous. So cool.
Yeah, and Clamp is like an all-female collective.
Yeah. And I mean that kind of art is like amazing. Like I love all the style of comics. This other comic that I really am kind of obsessed with is called Never Good Night by Coco Moodysson. Have you read that? It's just like this memoir comic about this Swedish woman and like her friends, and they like wanted to be punk when they were teenagers, but it was like kind of when punk was already over, so everyone was like making fun of them.
That's really cute.
It's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, like all the like your comic. Leonie's other comics, Psychic Hotline.
Yeah, definitely Leonie Riley's one of my favorite. I'll call them out now. I think that maybe we don't have that much time left. So one thing I just want to
15 minutes.
Yeah. One thing I just want to say is that one thing that a lot of people find quite empowering about comics is that you can draw bodies in any way. So this is a very casual one, Michael before. It should be so really exciting. Right? And they always draw bodies in really surreal, kind of gross ways. Like this magical deer. He's in this book. He's got all these weird diagrams of how they meet and stuff. It's really interesting. Anyway, so one thing I just wanted to say that is interesting about drawing comics is that it's really sensual. Like you draw with your whole body, and that sounds embarrassing to say out loud, but I find it extremely pleasurable. And one thing that I've you just get to feel how full of possibilities the body is, like endless possibilities. So when I was drawing Swimsuit, I really inhabited this character who looks really different to me, but I felt her in my body for a long time, and I still do. Like there's drawing her over and over again was like like acting, maybe, how actors feel. And yeah, as time goes on, I've become a lot more skeptical of gender labels and gender-specific ways of drawing people. So some other examples of this, if you're interested in queer artists, are Tommy Parrish, Your Big Frog, and Lee Lai. You can be whatever you want, and I think what's really exciting about comics is that you can draw yourself however you want, kind of like playing a computer game or something. So I think I've got. So this is a zine by Your Big Frog, who is another Melbourne artist. They're drawing all of the body and reiterating these kind of. You can tell that they're trying to figure out something very important and nuanced, but impossible to say without drawings. And then I'll just show you one last example, which is Lee Lai, who's now based in Canada but is from Melbourne. I think the way they draw people is very interesting because there's a lot of personality, but you never wonder like what their gender is. You know. Anyway, they are constant inspiration to me. Their work is really all about negotiating relationships, how difficult that can be at times. So do you think that I should show some physical tools like pens and stuff? Yeah. So we might need to like angle.
Oh, okay.
I'm not. Well, let's see. I can just hold up some stuff. So. Maybe I'll just show stuff. So the main things that I like to use are pencils and also ink. So in drawing something like this, that is all just pencil on paper, which was risographed in 2 different colors. So the pencils that I like to use are really soft and dark, so anything which is a B. And it feels ridiculous to hold up a pencil because you all know what a pencil looks like. And also I tend to use mechanical pencils because they stay sharp forever. The other thing that is really useful and that a lot of other comic artists like are these Pintail pens that have a reservoir of ink in them. So you can buy these from like, I think it's jetspens.com. And
Is this a brand?
Yeah. So you just how am I gonna do this? You squeeze the tummy and then it comes out, if that makes sense. So the good thing about this is that you can draw with a brush and ink anywhere on the train when you're traveling and stuff, and it's like a clean way to do it. And then you can just buy the cartridges to go in the pen online as well. But if you just Google Pintail brush pen, that's what all the cartoonists use. It's a hot tip. And then the other thing that I really like to draw with, which is quite traditional, is is a nib and ink, right? So the way you do this is you buy the nib holder, which looks like a normal pen. Well, it kind of looks like a brush, right? Except that it's got a gauge for an appendage here. So then you can buy all kinds of different nibs. The ones that I use are they're kind of different depending on what country they come from and kind of how flexible they are. So these are for manga and they're imported from Japan. There's an Australian website called Manga Art or something. It's run by this really cute older couple. But if you look at it, you can see it's got a really thin point, and then when you're drawing with it, it's extremely kind of flexible, so you can apply force and then the line will get thinner or thicker depending on how you manipulate it. The other type that I like to use for more detailed stuff are these Nico mapping nibs. I think they're called that because maybe they're what cartographers used to use. So you can see it's really skinny. So what you do when you have your nib is you insert it into the gap here in the pen. Like so. And then so push it in so that it feels taut, so that it won't move when you're drawing. And then one thing about if you buy nibs from America, I found, is that they sometimes have a waxy kind of thing on the surface to protect it. And then if you try to draw with it immediately, it won't work because the wax stops the ink from moving properly. So you have to hold it and melt off the wax with like a cigarette lighter or something. But yeah, for a while I was really, really confused because I was like, it couldn't make any lines. So these old school nibs, the way they work is a capillary action, if that makes sense. So there's two very, very fine pieces of metal. When you dip it in ink, the ink rises up through the capillary like water being drawn up through a plant. But I can demonstrate on it. So different kinds of ink as well. Some people are like really fanatical about the ink they use. This is De La Rowney. It's from the UK, and I really like it. I think it's got a good flow. I think as well, like more expensive inks just are much better than cheaper ones, I found. And then I'll just talk about two other ones. Ecoline, I first discovered this when I was living in Europe, but they're a bit different to other inks because they're water soluble. So as you add more layers, it still keeps mixing, and it's kind of quite difficult to work with. But I believe that's what Brecht even uses to get those kind of crazy effects that they have in their work. But they're really exciting to use, Ecoline, and I think that's what a lot of illustrators prefer. And then finally, I just wanted to show you this white ink, which is used for manga. This is from Japan. It's really great because you can see there's a tiny, it's so cute. Yeah, there's a tiny bird with red shoes and a red cap, but I'm not sure you'll be able to see it there. It's really good. Anyway, so how am I going to do this? Can the camera move down anymore? Well, I could hold this up. So I think you can see this. So you've got the nib in the pen. Make sure it's clean. You dip it in the ink, and then you'll see that it's kind of flowed up it, and then whoop. Oh shit, this isn't gonna work, is it? Oh, you can hear the scratchiness. So you can see, this is what I meant by it being really flexible. Sometimes it's really thin and scratchy, and other times it can be a really thick line. It's like a ribbon that you can manipulate. So this one was the zebra type. And then the other tool I like to use a lot is ink washers as well. So an example of this is that with Dream Diary and the longer story, it's all ink on paper. So I would use a nib pen to draw all the lines in detail, and then all the kind of gradations of black are just ink watered down in various ways. So the best way to do that, I think, is to work from light to dark in this instance. So you would just like everything that's light, you would do that first and just work your way across the image, like getting darker. And that way you kind of know when to stop, I guess. If you start off too dark, then that can be a bit scary. But as well, the other thing to say about this is that this is just the way that I like to draw, and a lot of people draw differently. And then, so with the black and white, what I think is really interesting is that you can, as well as going from light to dark, you can then add white ink into black ink while it's wet or when it's dry. And so when it's wet, you will get this kind of inky, you will get like some quite interesting effects, whereas when it's dry, you'll get a more distinct line. Yeah, that's. I'm not really sure what else to say about the actual bits and pieces of drawing. So unless there are any specific questions about that, we can. Are there any more questions? Cool. All right, I guess
we can wrap it up then.
I think so.
Thank you so much. That was really comprehensive, really useful. I don't know how to. Thanks everyone for tuning in to Toolkits Live.